Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Last week's Republican convention was the target of the largest protest in New York City in many years, and the most extensive and intense political demonstration at a presidential nominating convention since 1968. The week that was included more than 500,000 anti-Bush demonstrators, more than 1,800 arrests, 3 times the number arrested in Chicago in '68. This week, the city faces hundreds of thousands of dollars of state court-imposed fines for violating protesters' rights. What did it all mean? To help us understand the protest and its implications are Diane Cardwell, a reporter for the New York Times. Diane's stories provided the most detailed and nuanced coverage of the protest. And Neil Matteo, a filmmaker who is in post-production for a documentary on the demonstrations and protests for Mad Dog Films of New York. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for your coverage of this story. First question. Are we seeing the emergence of a mass grassroots movement outside the Democratic Party?
Well, I think, especially if you talk to the protesters, the answer is yes. You look at the enormous march that we saw on the Sunday, the day before the convention began, that swept up groups from all over the country, many different kinds of groups. Some affiliated with the Democratic Party, many having absolutely nothing to do with it. So, and it does seem, especially, talking to the organizers from UFPJ who planned that march, that you hadn't seen a lot of mass protests like this in a very long time, especially something as well organized and as peaceful. So, and a lot of the other organizers for other, protests, for protest days said that, they had thousands of people out in the street every day of the convention, and you just really haven't seen something like that before. You've been filming for months, interviews, etc. What's your sense of the people who protested? And is there an incipient movement?
I'd say yes, and I'd qualify it by that maybe it's been there for longer than we realized. I think the RNC became a flashpoint for a lot of this energy. In addition to the larger protests, there were many artistic performance types of protests going on, which are really very legitimate ways of just voicing your dissent. There were literally thousands of those throughout the summer and progressing towards the RNC.
One of the interesting things about the protest, particularly the Sunday march, that it was so peaceful that it didn't produce the drama that TV often flocks to. So, to a certain extent, by being responsible, you don't get the coverage. You're in sort of the horns of a dilemma. If you're responsible, you don't get covered, but if you're irresponsible, in this case, you help Bush.
Well, I actually think, though, that with that big rally, the point was hundreds of thousands of people in the street with a fairly uniform anti-Bush, anti-war kind of message. And in that instance, just the sheer number, it was a huge image, and it did actually get a lot of coverage. And so I think for UFPJ, being responsible actually worked to their advantage, and I'd say in 2 ways. One, with the big fight over getting Central Park, whether they would get to rally in Central Park. And, there was a lot of back and forth with the city, and it looked for a while like UFPJ didn't really know what it was trying to do, where it was headed, what would happen. But as a result, they remained the story for weeks and weeks and weeks.
I know, you covered it.
And people became really upset about the park, and that became a galvanizing issue. And so it may have actually helped them get the numbers in a way that they got in the end. And then at the same time, I also think even though there was some local coverage of, you know, the flaming dragon in the middle of the march, that did not become the story of Sunday. The story of Sunday was 500,000 people in the streets. You know, whoever's numbers you believe, there were many, many people out there.
Yeah.
I think that's true, but the counterpart to that is that the way it was perceived that United for Peace and Justice was handling the issue of the park and the grass, it inflamed a lot of the smaller groups or the dissidents, and they formed their own day in a sense on 8/31. They called that for August 31st. And I believe that was the largest number of arrests, too, was on August 31st.
Right, that Tuesday.
A lot of those, I felt, were instigated through the previous few months of frustrations with the administration, of not being able to get permits, of the frustrations that United for Peace and Justice had. So actually Tuesday was very much in, I'd say Tuesday's results started probably months ahead of time. I think Sunday was a great day. We really saw the police behave well, and you saw the protesters behave well. But you can't think of Sunday without thinking of Tuesday. They're sort of like they dovetail to each other.
Okay. Even on Tuesday, though, the anarchists, we were bombarded with these threats of the anarchists were coming, Molotov cocktails, thousands of arrests. They were talking about 1,000 arrests a day. In fact, there were only 1,800 arrests over the period of 5 or 6 days. Was there a tactic here, part of a larger strategy on the part of the police department and others to discourage people from coming and to sort of set a negative frame for what was happening?
Well, certainly some of those reports of, Molotov cocktails or, the warnings, many of the anarchists, many of whom were not violent and never intended to be violent, they certainly intended some disobedience, although some of them didn't even intend disobedience. But certainly there was a lot of, kind of doom and gloom coming out of the police department, and worry and fear. At the same time, what I think you saw was a an almost kind of preemptive policing where, I believe it's become known within the department as the Kelly Doctrine, that you respond rapidly.
The Kelly Doctrine.
Right, that you respond rapidly to anything that's happening so that you keep things from being able to escalate, and, you avoid the kind of very hostile, very violent standoffs that we've seen between police and protesters in other cities. But you also sometimes sweep people into nets and put them in jail or into a holding pen on the pier who have not really broken the law.
Yeah, so it's rapid, massive response that chokes off protest before it begins. However, there were instances, and there are charges, that the police's prophylactic efforts in some senses precipitated problems. The famous case of the motor scootered cop who was beaten by protesters received wide play in, the electronic media and in the tabloids. But Neil, we've got film here from that you've got that seems to show a different picture. Set up the next 35 seconds of film.
Well, this is Monday night evening. This is the end of the Poor People's Economic Campaign that started in the UN at about 4 o'clock, and they marched along towards Madison Square Garden, probably ended around 8 or 9 o'clock. High energy but very peaceful march. And Sherry Hunkela, who's the leader of that group, had asked everybody to make it a peaceful march, and they certainly did. We had 4 shooters there ourselves covering this march, but this film you're going to see was actually shot by Alex Young, that we acquired some limited rights to this footage. Alex Young's from Denver. He came here on vacation just to participate in the protests. And what you'll see is the part that you didn't see evidently in the news media, or the news media, I'll put it that way, in terms of what precipitated the subsequent beating. It appears as if there are plainclothes officers on scooters who are ramming into the protesters and again, this is at the end of the march. The police evidently are starting to cordon off the march. They're putting up the pens, and in one of the middle sections of this is where this incident you're about to see on the TV occurred. And
then the individual that we're looking at has a Ruth 3 jersey on, and you'll subsequently see that many of the plainclothes cops had New York Yankee paraphernalia.
Correct.
Okay, let's watch it and then let's come back.
Well, as you can see there, obviously the officers, or rather the plainclothes officers on scooters, were being provocative. They were attacking or pushing into, possibly even hurting people within the protest. We saw no other evidence that anybody within the protesters was being violent in any way, so we don't know what could have instigated this kind of behavior from the police.
Diane, your reaction, and as a member of the media, were you aware of the precipitant of this activity? Because I certainly wasn't before Neil showed me the film.
Well, I hadn't actually seen it before, but certainly we had some reports from protesters that there had been some, using of the motorcycles and the scooters to kind of corral the crowd here and there. And this is apparently a tactic that people saw on the Critical Mass bike ride, which was the first big bunch of arrests, I think, on Friday night. But one of the things that happened, I think, during the protest is that we saw a lot of inconsistent response from the police to the protesters. So in this case, with this march, one of the things that happened is that people who were at the front of the march said that everything was going along very peacefully, was really happy. They felt like they were being escorted by the police. And then suddenly, for no reason, from what they could tell, barricades start coming out, scooters are coming into the crowd, and arrests start to be made. And part of that, I think, is because so many of these decisions are made at a commander level. It's individual commanding officers deciding, okay, here's what we have to do to keep the peace.
Right.
And sometimes they seem to be much more flexible than others.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were examples of police actually escorting unpermitted protesters to march from Central Park to Union Square. And then I was there at the march on Sunday and in some of the activities on Monday and Tuesday. And from my vantage point, for the most part, there was a great deal of civility, certainly on Sunday. There was a great deal of civility on the part of both the protesters and the cops. Not only the cops professional and they were at attention and they were masked and they were moved, there was dialogue and it was all friendly. I did not hear one. As a matter of fact, there were protesters proposing that the cops get pay raises, which drew smiles and some clucking from the police themselves. So in the main, it seems as if it was a highly professional police activity, but as you suggest, that individual discretion could have led to some problems.
Right, well, you would see, I believe it was Thursday morning, I think it was a Housing Works protest at Grand Central Station, and inside, a group of protesters surrounded the information booth, and they got arrested. And then outside, there were maybe, at one point, as many as 100 people marching outside Grand Central Station. The police were working with them. They were negotiating. They were absolutely blocking the sidewalk, but the police, someone had made a decision that they were going to allow them to have their demonstration, and they were going to work with them throughout to keep it legal. And at the end, one of the organizers was basically saying, this is great. The people who wanted to get arrested got arrested. The rest of us are out here representing, and now we're going to disperse in small groups. No one's going in the subway station, and everybody seemed happy.
Now, you folks were embedded in the various marches. What's your sense? I mean, we've seen this one piece of video. What's your sense of the police response generally?
I would say it's an anomaly. I'd say overall it was very professional, very straightforward, and greatly appreciated. However, there were several incidences, again, with these plainclothes officers on scooters, not just the one that you just saw now, but also if you go back to the prior Sunday, the day before, there was a mini critical mass, or a bike block they call it, where the bicyclists went out. And again, there was these plainclothes officers on scooters, and I don't have the footage right now, but we're trying to acquire it, but I saw it that night, Sunday night, basically trying to run the bicyclists off the road. I mean, creating, if anything, a dangerous situation. Not sure, again, why they're doing this, other than that they were trying to just stop the bicyclists from doing their thing.
But this Kelly doctrine, it seems as if it is becoming a conventional wisdom now in terms of how to handle large groups of potentially recalcitrant people.
Right.
Well, you saw that Friday night, actually. At the big critical mass, there was probably about 10,000 bicyclists that formed at Union Square. They went off on their ride. For the first hour, we were amidst them. We were filming amidst them. For the first hour, the police, if anything, were assisting with traffic and everything. It seemed that about an hour into the ride, when the energy got too high or something, I'm not sure what, our group, certainly that we were part of, was shut down. The street was shut down, and everybody there was arrested. Not us, not the filmmakers, but also. And I noticed that at the same time in other parts of the city, the same thing happened. At some point, somebody said, "Shut it down now," and these mass arrests started to happen.
One thought that just popped into my mind: not only were the police particularly civil to the protesters, but they were very accommodating to the press. Those of us who had press passes really had pretty much access in and out of the barricades, and normally they're much more hesitant to do that. Okay, let's step back. Diane, how did you get assigned to the story? What was the Times coverage of this story? Now, this story goes back months because there's the whole Central Park permit protest over the protest through the protests themselves.
Right, and it actually began months and months and months before that. Many months ago, I was brought in as part of a team, and I probably started reporting intensively on it about 2 months ago, just sort of looking at, and my area was protest, but more from a kind of institutional, governmental perspective, sort of looking at the permit process and how that was or wasn't working, the sort of official city response to the protests and how they were going to do it.
Particularly given your City Hall bureau experience. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And then also some of the court cases, the court battles. There were other reporters, there was Michael Brick, whose assignment was to kind of be embedded with a group of protesters, and Randy Archibald, who was kind of doing protest work really wherever he gravitated, but he ended up gravitating to a lot of the anarchist groups, and so he did a lot of those stories. And then, of course, there's Michael Slackman, who was sort of doing politics overall, but got involved in covering the protests as well.
And the Times really gave it extensive coverage. In fact, I've got a collection of Diane Cardwell page one stories here, both with Slackman, with Mark Santoro, by yourself. I mean, this is a coup.
Unlikely to be repeated
Unlikely to
soon.
be repeated. How did you get involved in this?
I got involved about 5 months ago. Kevin Soling, who's the president of Mad Dog Films, good friend, we had dinner together, as we do every few months, and he said, I'd really like to do a film about the RNC and the protests. And we talked it over, and we realized this could be a summer that won't be repeated for 20, 30, 40 years. So we wanted to capture it on video and film, and we wanted to do a balanced documentary in terms of covering the protest side as much as we could, also from the Republican side, from the administration side.
Give us some sense of what you covered, the types of interviews, the types of activities. What are we going to see on the documentary that reflects what you guys did?
Well, that's a good question. We have over 300 hours of footage, so we're in post-production now. But since May, we've been working with about 8 or 9 of the protest groups. Some that allowed us into their meetings, into their grassroots efforts. We've also been interviewing other personalities along the way in terms of discussing issues such as the grass, Central Park, the Conservancy. And even in the last month, we were very fortunate to be able to be invited, not to the convention itself, but to some off-convention site Republican functions.
Good.
So again, trying to bring that balance in there. We wanted to show two things. What's the face of dissent today, using New York as a microcosm? Who are the people and why are they doing this? And not just the top people in terms of, they're leading the large protests, but the many other smaller groups that feel an urgency to do this. And then the second point is to take a snapshot on what is the state of dissent today. If you do dissent, what is it going to look like in terms of what you're able to do? What's the police and the administration's reactions? What's the public's reaction? So those are the two things we're hoping to come out in the documentary.
Diane, you did some stories on Code Pink and the Billionaires for Bush. I know Neil was particularly interested in that. There were some very intriguing groups and individuals. Code Pink, talk about them, because they provided some of the most dramatic moments in this convention.
Right. Well, I think ultimately, Code Pink was one of the most successful at getting their message out, and that's partly because they managed to get into the garden every night. I mean, here you have this incredibly protected, have been like the best secured building, except maybe for Fort Knox, and maybe it was more, but they got in.
Human history.
Right, and they got in and, unfurled their banners and pulled up their shirts and showed their slips and, and this is what they have basically done since they started. They kind of love to get in where they aren't supposed to be.
And they got in during Cheney, they got in during Bush, they got in during some of the high points of this.
Exactly.
What about Billionaires for Bush?
Well, one of the things we're going to do in the film actually is have a subplot of the Yippies. We're going to go back to the Yippies a little bit, because we think that's the lineage that if you don't have the Yippies and Abbie Hoffman, you don't have Billionaires for Bush, you don't have the Yes Men, you don't have even some of the things Code Pink does in terms of the humor, using satire
and theater. It's just real street theater but it's humorous and it's engaging, humorous in some. I guess if you're the target of it, it's not very funny. Street theater.
No, I think Billionaires for Bush have been extremely successful in using satire to attract people to their cause, which is to satirize the Republicans. Even more humorous is sometimes you watch the police and you see they have to both the Billionaires for Bush, and then you have the hardcore protesters, and they think they have to keep them separated. And they're not. They're all on the same side in some sense.
We saw the Billionaires for Bush on Fifth Avenue on Sunday, and their chant was "For More Wars." Right. And they were elegantly dressed in evening gowns and furs.
Tiaras.
There were literally hundreds of these folks. It was really quite remarkable. I mean, if you were out for a show on Sunday, you certainly got it. Diane, impact on Bloomberg. Speculate. I mean, the mayor was real uptight about this. He walked the tightrope. He seems to have not fallen off. Right. I mean, any ideas?
Well, in the end, I think, he looks very good. I think the city benefits a lot. Although I think that there are two sides to it, of course, but I think overall, the city showed that it can handle an event of this magnitude, that it, with all the terror threats, with all the threats of protester violence, it was able to handle it and pull it off and, keep the city safe. At the same time, we do have these fines that are going to be levied. You had people held for way longer than they should have been by law. So there are some problems that I think we're going to see play themselves out, especially as we get closer to the election, as we get closer to, the 1,000th death in Iraq. I think you'll start to see some of these issues come into play again.
Talk about what you do now, Neil. You've got 300 hours worth of video. It comes down to an hour and a half, 2 hours. What do you what do you see as sort of the emerging themes, or what is your theory going in?
You're asking a difficult question. There's an old adage in filmmaking: it's not what you see, it's what the camera sees. So we now copiously go through all the footage, and a lot of the themes we think are there will start to appear or not, and other themes may appear. We're also continuing, by the way, filming, doing a lot of interviews for the people who were arrested, who were in, as it's called, Guantanamo on the Hudson, I guess.
This is what, Pier 57?
Pier 57. We think actually that's part of the story in terms of, we do have to go back and say, during some of the mass arrests, a lot of people were arrested that didn't need to get arrested. People who were in the press, the Lawyers Guild. I heard even a few delegates got arrested. Again, these were mass sweeps. Miraculously, all of my camera people did not. I heard some great stories how they escaped through Starbucks and other things like that. But that's part of the story, will be this follow-up with all of these arrests and how the people were treated. All week I'm interviewing people who have been in detention for 45 hours and going through what may be very, heinous situations.
When do you expect us to be able to see this? Are we going to be able to see it in time for what?
Somebody's inauguration in January. That's we don't know whose inauguration, but I'd say January.
Diane, you done with protests?
For the moment, you never know.
What's next?
I go back to Brooklyn, where I sort of happily cover that. Maybe do some more national political reporting for a little while, and then we'll see.
Tired of protests?
I would say I am glad to be done with this particular phase of the protests.
Okay. Neil, what's your next endeavor? You go from here. Has this, in our conversations, it seems as if this notion of a new movement has, in a sense, grabbed you. Is that your next, to delve deeper into this, that the protests are the symbol of something else here?
I don't know if that would be it. I would say that it certainly opened my eyes to the state of dissent today, and also to, you have to excuse me, Diane, but that I used to be, I worked for 20 years in corporations, and I would watch the news, and I believe 90% of what the news would say, and now it's flipped. It's now, I believe, maybe 10%. And I was just at too many events that I then saw on TV that night that had no bearing on what I saw. And that opened my eyes a lot to what happens in terms of public policy and in terms of our own civil liberties. So there's something that's probably brewing there that I'll be working on.
Excellent. So I hope to see both of you here after the election. Oh, I have a commitment from you?
Sure.
And you?
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.